In January of 1942, a month after Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt and the Navy took a hard look at the estimated completion dates of the new Essex class. Even by speeding construction, it wasn't looking good. So it was decided that in order to produce more carriers fast enough that had the speed to keep up with the big carriers, eventually 9 Cleveland-class light cruisers that were either already under construction or were planned were slated for conversion. Many at the various design bureaus weren't happy with the idea, since the ships would be by necessity very limited. Unfortunately, there was a war on, so the time had come to shoot the engineers and build them. These were completed as the 11,000-ton Independence class. Independence was reordered in January of 1942, 2 more in February, 3 in March, and 3 more in June. All were completed in 1943, about the same time as the first 8 Essexes they would serve along. The conversion was simplistic enough to speed construction, but thorough enough to be useful, taking the hull to its very limit. The main hull under the hangar was essentially changed just enough to be functional. The only major change was the boiler exhausts were vented to funnels that came out the starboard side behind the island, then bent upward so as to maximize hangar and flight deck space. The magazines became bomb storage. Bulges were added to maintain buoyancy and help with stability. They also allowed more fuel to be carried. The plus this minus that factor meant there was only a negligible cost in speed. Above the main deck, which became the hangar floor, in place of the superstructure and turrets, a light hangar and flight deck along the lines of the Sangamon escort carriers was built. To maximize flight deck and hangar space, originally they were planned to be flush-decked, but in the event, a small escort carrier-style island was fitted outboard of the flight deck. The hangar was enclosed, which made it hard to warm up aircraft there. To be honest, from a technical point of view, the engineers were right. These ships were limited compared to the large carriers. Their flight decks were short and narrow compared to the large carriers. They could only carry 1/3 as many of the number of aircraft as the large carriers. Even then, only by carrying mostly fighters. They carried no reserve aircraft. They could carry far less fuel and weapons for their aircraft or themselves, some in their hangar. They had to be refueled and resupplied more often. They were also poorer sea boats, rolling and pitching, while the large carriers and even Sangamon escort carriers remained steady. While obviously not as impressive as the Essexes, they were actually very useful considering their size, speed of construction, and they were conversions. Between them, they brought almost 300 aircraft, mostly the all-important fighters that the fleet otherwise wouldn't have had. That's gotta count for something. Originally just called carriers, they were retitled light carriers July 15, 1943. Independence, ex-Amsterdam, was started May 1, 1941, and completed January 1, 1943. Princeton, ex-Tallahassee, was started June 2, 1941, and completed February 25, 1943. Bellewood, ex-New Haven, was started August 11, 1941, and completed March 31, 1943. Cowpens, ex-Huntington, was started November 17, 1941, and completed May 28, 1943. Monterey, ex-Dayton, was started December 29, 1941, and completed June 17, 1943. Langley, ex-Crown Point, ex-Fargo, was started April 11, 1942, and completed August 31, 1943. Cabot, ex-Wilmington, was started March 16, 1942, and completed July 24, 1943. Bataan, ex-Buffalo, was started August 31, 1942, and completed May 13, 1943. San Jacinto, ex-Reprisal, ex-Newark, was started October 26, 1942, and completed December 15, 1943. Main armament on Independence was initially 2 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns in single open mounts, one on the bow, one on the stern. The rest were completed with only light and medium anti-aircraft. Propulsion was 4 boilers venting to 2 pairs of funnels on the starboard side. These provided steam to 4 turbines that produced 100,000 horsepower. Each drove one of the 4 propellers. This produced a top speed of 31 knots. Like their cruiser sisters, they had 2 rudders. Protection was good for their size. The hangar floor was 2 inches, increasing to 2¼ inches over the steering gear. Up to 5-inch bulkheads protected the ends of the ship's vitals. Side armor varied. Independence and Princeton were completed with no belt armor to speed production. Only 2 inches covered the forward magazines. The rest were able to work in side armor. In addition to the 2-inch covering the forward magazine, a 5-inch belt tapered down to 3¼ inches. The machinery was fitted on the unit principle. That is to say, the forward compartment had 2 boilers. Next came an engine room with the 2 turbines that ran the outer shafts and left the gap between the 2 sets of funnels. Then came the other fire room with the other 2 boilers. Finally came the rear engine room with the 2 turbines that ran the inner shafts. The TDS was minimal, mostly being 2 layers thick, the outer one being empty and the inner one usually filled with fuel oil. Like most warships their size, they were double-bottomed. The flight deck was 552 feet by 73 feet and mounted a single catapult. There were 2 elevators, both 44 by 42 feet. The hangar was 258 feet by 55 feet by 17¼ feet and ran from the forward elevator to the rear one. Behind it was the aircraft workshops and torpedo storage. In front of it was crew quarters, including the aircraft briefing room and the CIC. Aircraft complement was generally in the low 30s, usually about 24 Hellcat fighters and 9 Avengers. Modifications were minimal, mostly limited to more medium and light anti-aircraft along with improved radar. Shortly after completion of trials before transferring to the Pacific, Independence traded her 5-inch 38 calibers for more medium anti-aircraft guns like her sisters. In mid-1944 through 45, as they came in for repairs and refit, they added a second flight deck catapult. Independence joined the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in late July of 1943 and began training her pilots. Her first mission was the training raids on Marcus in late August, and now joined by Bellewood and Cowpens, Wake in early October. Joined by Princeton, Independence took part in the raids on Buka and Rubal in early November. With the addition of Monterey in late November, they covered the Gilbert's invasion while Princeton headed to the west coast for upkeep. On November 20th, while covering the invasion of the Gilberts, Independence was hit aft by an aircraft torpedo that badly damaged her, sending her back to the west coast for repairs. In mid-January of 1944, Princeton returned with the new Langley and Cabot just in time for them to take part in the invasion of the Marshalls. With the addition of Bataan in April, they covered the final liberation of New Guinea. Now joined by San Jacinto in June, they took part in the liberation of the Marianas, including the Battle of the Philippine Sea. In mid-July, Bataan's forward elevator broke down, sending her back to the west coast for repairs, refit, and training that would last until March of 1945. In late August, Independence finally returned, now carrying night fighters, for the attack on the Palaus. Next, they covered the liberation of Leyte, including raids on Taiwan and Okinawa and the Battle of Leyte Gulf. During the battle at 10 a.m. on the morning of October 24th, as the carriers were launching strikes against the Japanese center force in the Sibuyan Sea, a lone Japanese plane slipped in and dropped a bomb on Princeton. The bomb penetrated her flight deck and exploded in the hangar, which was full of armed and fueled aircraft. Fires and explosion racked the lightly built carrier as the cruiser Birmingham came alongside to render aid. At 3:20 p.m., a magazine finally baked off in an explosion that not only mortally wounded Princeton, but killed or wounded nearly half of Birmingham's crew. With fires out of control and a fluid battle still going on, even as dusk approached, at 5:45 p.m., the cruiser Reno scuttled the burned-out hulk. 6 days later, on October 30th, a kamikaze hit the rear of Bellewood's flight deck. starting a raging fire which sent her back to the west coast for repairs. On November 25th, a kamikaze hit Cabot, starting fires. A second near miss showered her with flaming debris. Repairs would take nearly 3 weeks. At the end of 1944 and the start of 1945, they covered the liberation of the northern Philippines, including raids into the South China Sea, and endured Typhoon Cobra. At the end of January, Independence and Monterey sailed to the west coast for overhaul. In early February, Bellewood returned just in time to cover the invasion of Iwo Jima. In early March, Cowpens headed to the west coast for overhaul. In mid-March, Independence, Monterey, and Bataan returned as the fleet covered the invasion of Okinawa, including preliminary attacks on southern and central Japan. In June, Langley and Cabot returned to the west coast for refits that would effectively last the rest of the war. With the return of Cowpens from July to the end of the war, they took part in the raids on Japan, including the final destruction of the Japanese fleet in late July. Post-war, these emergency carriers became surplus. Independence was relegated to the Bikini bomb tests, both of which she survived, only to be sunk as a target in January of 1951. Bellewood and Langley were lent to the French Navy in June of 1951, only to be returned and scrapped in 1960 and 63 respectively. Cabot was first loaned and then sold to the Spanish Navy in 1967. Almost painfully, despite being mostly unmodified when decommissioned in 1989, a decade of preservation efforts failed, and she was auctioned off for scrap in 1999.